March 1943. Mid-Atlantic. The ocean is black under a moonless sky. No stars, just the sound of waves folding over themselves in the dark. Inside U-boat U-530, 48 men breathe recycled air that tastes like diesel and sweat. The hull groans under pressure. Water drips from overhead pipes. A young radio man named Klaus adjusts his headset, listening to silence. He believes they are invisible. Above them, 5 kilometers away, the American destroyer USS Borie cuts through the same water. Her decks are slick with spray. Her crew stands at battle stations, eyes scanning a horizon they cannot see. But inside the sonar room, a different kind of vision is unfolding. A technician named Petty Officer Raymond watches a glowing cathode screen. A faint ping returns, then another. He marks the bearing with a grease pencil. The Germans below have no idea they are being watched. They do not know that sound itself has become a weapon, that darkness no longer protects them. The Battle of the Atlantic did not begin with sonar. It began with desperation. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, Britain and France declared war. Within weeks, German U-boats were prowling the Atlantic, hunting merchant convoys that carried food, fuel, and weapons from America to Britain. The strategy was simple: starve the island into surrender. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, believed submarines could win the war before a single German soldier set foot in England. He was nearly right. By 1940, U-boats were sinking Allied ships faster than they could be replaced. Convoys moved in tight formations, protected by destroyers and corvettes, but the escorts were too few and too blind. At night, U-boats surfaced to recharge batteries and attack from the darkness. They used the cover of storms. They coordinated in wolf packs, overwhelming defenses with numbers. British sailors called it the killing time. In 1941 alone, the Allies lost over 3,300 merchant ships. That's more than 3 ships every day. Entire convoys were wiped out. Lifeboats drifted for weeks. Bodies washed ashore in Newfoundland and Ireland. Churchill later wrote that the U-boat peril was the only thing that ever truly frightened him during the war. The Royal Navy tried everything: depth charges, ramming, air patrols. But the Atlantic is vast, and submarines are small. A U-boat on the surface at night, painted gray, was almost impossible to see. Radar existed, but early models were crude, short-range, and easily fooled by weather. The Germans knew this. They surfaced at night with confidence. By early 1942, the United States had entered the war. German U-boats immediately moved west, targeting the unprotected American coast. They sank tankers within sight of Miami and New York. Beaches were covered in oil. Civilians watched ships burn from their porches. Dönitz called it the second happy time. In the first 6 months of 1942, U-boats sank over 600 Allied ships in American waters alone. The Allies were losing the war at sea. But something was changing. In labs and shipyards, a quiet revolution was underway. Engineers were perfecting a technology that would turn the ocean into a surveillance grid. It was called ASDIC by the British, sonar by the Americans, active sound navigation and ranging. The concept was old, using sound pulses to detect objects underwater. But the execution was new, American. Destroyers began receiving upgraded sonar systems in late 1942. The QC-type sonar could send a focused acoustic pulse and measure the returning echo with startling precision. Operators could detect a submerged U-boat at ranges exceeding 2,500 yards. They could track its depth, speed, and heading, and they could do it in total darkness. The Germans had no idea. German naval intelligence was thorough, but not omniscient. They knew about depth charges and escort tactics. They understood British convoy routing and radio direction finding. But they fundamentally underestimated Allied sonar capability. German submariners were trained to dive when spotted visually or by radar. Once submerged, they believed themselves hidden. U-boat commanders assumed that Allied ships relied on guesswork and patterns, dropping depth charges in grids, hoping for a lucky hit. The idea that an enemy destroyer could see them underwater in real time using invisible sound waves was not part of their operational doctrine. This was not arrogance. It was a gap in knowledge. Germany had its own sonar systems, called S-Gerät, but they were passive listening devices. They could detect propeller noise from enemy ships, but could not send out active pings without giving away the U-boat's position. German submariners used hydrophones to listen, not to hunt. The concept of active sonar as a tracking weapon was theoretically understood, but practically dismissed. Why? Because early sonar was unreliable. It gave false echoes. It was confused by thermal layers, schools of fish, wrecks, and turbulence. In 1940, it was more nuisance than tool. German naval strategists studied captured British sonar equipment and concluded it was interesting but not decisive. They were wrong. By 1943, American and British sonar had evolved rapidly. New training schools taught operators to distinguish real targets from noise. Technicians learned to read water temperature, salinity, and layer depth. Sonar became less about technology and more about skill. A trained operator could identify the metallic echo of a submarine hull versus the organic scatter of a whale. They could estimate range within 50 yards, and the Allies had hundreds of these operators now. Escort carriers, destroyer escorts, and corvettes formed hunter-killer groups. They worked in coordination with long-range patrol aircraft. When a U-boat was detected on the surface by radar or visual contact, it would dive. The aircraft would drop a smoke float or sonobuoy to mark the position. Destroyers would race in, activate sonar, and begin the hunt. Once sonar had a contact, the U-boat was trapped. The submarine would try evasive maneuvers, turning sharply, going deep, cutting engines. But sound travels efficiently underwater. Every movement created noise. Every hull creak, every rivet, every propeller blade was a signal. The destroyers would converge, pinging continuously, adjusting depth charge patterns based on real-time data. It was methodical, relentless. From inside a U-boat, the crew would hear the pings, at first distant, then louder, then impossibly close. The sound would pass through the hull like a hammer. Men would freeze. The captain would order silence. No talking, no tools, no movement. The boat would go silent running, drifting at minimum speed. But the pings kept coming. And then the depth charges. Each explosion sent a pressure wave through the water. Even a near miss could crack welds, shatter gauges, blow lights. A direct hit would crush the hull like foil. Survivors described the experience as being inside a drum while someone hit it with a sledgehammer. Over and over. By mid-1943, U-boat losses were climbing. In May alone, the Kriegsmarine lost 43 submarines. Dönitz withdrew his fleet from the North Atlantic temporarily. For the first time, the hunters had become the hunted. The human angle. Life in the sonar room, inside the USS Borie, Petty Officer Raymond sits in near-total darkness. The sonar room is cramped, barely larger than a closet. The cathode screen glows green. He wears heavy headphones, listening to the returning echoes. Ping. Pause. Ping. Each pulse travels outward at 1,500 meters per second, bounces off anything solid, and returns. When he hears the metallic return, sharp, clear, distinct, he marks it on the plotting board. Contact. Bearing 270. Range 1,800 yards. The officer of the deck receives the report. Orders are given. The destroyer changes course. The sonar operator listens again. The echo is stronger now. He adjusts the beam angle, focusing the pulse. The U-boat is moving left. He reports the new bearing. This is not guesswork. This is geometry. Raymond has been trained at the Navy's sonar school in Key West. he learned to distinguish echoes by tone and decay. A submarine sounds different from a whale. A wreck sounds different from a rock. He learned to account for water temperature. Warm layers bend sound downward. Cold layers upward. He learned to stay calm under pressure, to trust the machine, to report what he hears without interpretation. His job is to turn sound into information. And tonight, he is very good at his job. The tactical angle. The hunter-killer doctrine. By 1943, the U.S. Navy had developed a systematic doctrine for anti-submarine warfare. It was called the hunter-killer strategy, and it relied on coordination between multiple platforms. First, detection. Long-range patrol aircraft, PBY Catalinas, B-24 Liberators, scanned vast areas of ocean using radar and visual reconnaissance. When a U-boat was spotted on the surface, the aircraft would attack with depth bombs or mark the position with smoke floats. Second, convergence. Nearby destroyer escorts would be vectored to the location. They would arrive at high speed, forming a search pattern around the last known position. Third, prosecution. Once sonar contact was established, the destroyers would box in the submarine. One ship would maintain sonar contact, feeding bearing and range data. Others would maneuver into attack positions. Depth charges would be dropped in calculated patterns, ahead of the target, behind, to either side, creating a lethal zone. Fourth, confirmation. After the attack, destroyers would return to the area, listening for breakup noises, metal tearing, air escaping, debris surfacing. Oil slicks and wreckage confirmed a kill. This system was devastatingly effective. U-boats had no counter. They could not outrun destroyers on the surface. They could not hide once detected underwater. The technological angle. How sonar actually worked. Active sonar operates on a simple principle. Sound reflects off solid objects. The sonar transducer, a device mounted on the destroyer's hull, generates a powerful acoustic pulse. This pulse spreads outward in a cone, traveling through the water until it strikes something dense. When the pulse hits a submarine, part of the sound energy reflects back toward the source. The transducer, now acting as a receiver, detects this echo. The time delay between transmission and reception reveals the distance. The direction of the returning echo reveals the bearing. But the ocean complicates everything. Sound does not travel in straight lines underwater. It bends, refracts, and scatters depending on water conditions. Temperature gradients create layers where sound bends sharply. A submarine hiding below a thermocline, a boundary between warm surface water and cold deep water, could become invisible to sonar. Experienced sonar operators learned to recognize these layers. They adjusted ping frequency and angle to account for refraction. They used multiple pings to confirm contacts. They communicated with the bridge, describing what they heard in precise clinical terms. The technology was not infallible. False contacts were common. Whales, shipwrecks, dense schools of fish. But training reduced errors. By 1943, American sonar operators had a contact-to-kill ratio that terrified German submariners. The enemy angle inside U-530 Klaus, the radio man aboard U-530, does not hear the first ping. The boat is running submerged at 70 meters, moving slowly on electric motors. The captain is confident. They evaded an aircraft hours ago. Now they are deep, silent, invisible. Then the pinging starts. It is faint at first, like a distant hammer tapping on steel. Klaus looks at the hydrophone operator, who nods grimly. The sound grows louder. The crew freezes. Everyone knows what it means. The captain orders a course change. The boat turns hard to starboard, diving deeper. The motors are cut to minimum revs. Men hold their breath. The pinging continues, now louder, more insistent. It is coming from above and behind them. Klaus feels the hull vibrate with each pulse. The sound is physical, invasive. It passes through steel, through water, through his body. He realizes, with cold certainty, that the enemy knows exactly where they are. The captain orders evasive maneuvers, turns, depth changes, speed variations. Nothing works. The pinging follows. Then comes the unmistakable sound of propellers overhead. Multiple ships, closing fast. The first depth charge detonates 300 meters away. The hull shudders, lights flicker. A pipe bursts, spraying seawater. Men scramble to patch it. The captain's face is pale. He orders full silent running, but the pings do not stop. The leadership angle. Dönitz's dilemma Admiral Karl Dönitz receives the reports in his headquarters in Berlin. U-boat losses are accelerating. April, 15 boats lost. May, 43 boats lost. June, 17 boats lost. The numbers are unsustainable. He reads the after-action reports from surviving commanders. They describe being hunted underwater for hours. They describe destroyers that seem to know their exact position even in total darkness. They describe depth charge patterns that are too accurate to be coincidence. Dönitz is a submarine veteran himself. He commanded U-boats in World War I. He understands the psychological toll of being hunted. But he also understands the strategic reality. If U-boat losses continue at this rate, the Atlantic campaign is over. He considers withdrawing the entire fleet, redesigning tactics, upgrading technology. But Germany is already losing the technological race. The Allies have radar, sonar, escort carriers, long-range aircraft. Germany has courage and experience, but those are not enough. In May 1943, Dönitz makes the decision. He temporarily withdraws U-boats from the North Atlantic convoy routes. It is not surrender, he tells his commanders. It is a tactical repositioning. But everyone knows the truth. The Battle of the Atlantic has turned. March 19, 1943. 02:30 hours. North Atlantic. The USS Borie is part of Escort Group A3, protecting convoy HX-229. The convoy consists of 40 merchant ships carrying fuel, grain, and aircraft parts from New York to Liverpool. Intelligence reports indicate Wolfpack activity in the area. U-boats U-384, U-530, and U-618 are shadowing the convoy, waiting for the moment to strike. The night is overcast. No moon. Visibility is less than 100 yards. Radar is picking up scattered contacts, but they are intermittent, likely whales or debris. The sonar room is active, pinging every 30 seconds. At 02:47, Petty Officer Raymond hears something different. The echo is sharp, metallic. Bearing 195 degrees, range 2,000 yards. He reports it immediately. The officer of the deck orders a course change. The destroyer accelerates to 20 knots, turning toward the contact. Raymond pings again. The contact is still there. Range 1,800 yards. It is moving slowly. Depth estimated at 80 meters. He marks the bearing on the plotting board. The pattern is consistent. This is not a whale. Sonar contact confirmed. Classified submarine. The captain orders general quarters. Alarms sound throughout the ship. Men scramble to battle stations. The depth charge crews prepare their weapons, modified oil drums filled with 300 pounds of high explosive, each fitted with a hydrostatic fuse set to detonate at a specific depth. The destroyer closes to 1,000 yards. The sonar pings are continuous now. The U-boat is trying to evade, turning left, descending. Raymond tracks every movement. He reports bearing changes every 15 seconds. The fire control team calculates the attack pattern. At 03:05, the Borie reaches the attack position. Commence depth charge run. The first charges roll off the stern racks. They sink quickly, trailing bubbles. 10 seconds later, the fuses trigger. The ocean erupts. 4 massive explosions send geysers of white water 50 feet into the air. The destroyer shakes from the concussion. Sailors on deck are knocked off balance. Inside U-530, the world becomes chaos. The first explosion is distant but violent. The hull flexes. Men are thrown against bulkheads. Glass dials shatter. The lights go out, replaced by emergency red lamps. Klaus clutches a pipe, his ears ringing. The captain is shouting orders, but the words are muffled, drowned out by the roaring pressure. 3 more explosions. Closer. The boat rolls 15 degrees to port. Water sprays from a cracked seam near the forward torpedo room. The chief engineer screams for damage reports. The hydrophone operator's headset is torn off his head by the shock wave. The captain orders a crash dive to maximum depth. The boat angles downward sharply. Men slide across the deck. Equipment breaks loose. The hull groans under the pressure. They descend past 100 meters, 120, 140. The depth gauge needle trembles. They are beyond safe limits. Above, the Borie circles back. Sonar reacquires the contact. It has gone deeper, but it is still there. Raymond can hear the propeller noise now. A faint, rhythmic thrum. The U-boat is trying to escape. Range 900 yards. Depth estimated 150 meters. Bearing steady. The captain orders a second attack. The Borie maneuvers into position again. This time, the depth charges are set deeper, 350 feet. The crew works quickly, rolling charges off both stern racks and side throwers. 8 charges in total. They form a 3-dimensional killing pattern. The charges detonate in sequence. The first explosion hits directly astern of U-530. The shock wave strikes the submarine like a fist. The stern compartment floods instantly. The chief engineer is killed by the blast. Water pours in through ruptured seams. The stern begins to sink. The captain realizes they are finished. He orders emergency surface procedures. Compressed air is blown into the ballast tanks. The boat begins to rise, but it is sluggish, heavy. The stern is dragging. At 03:22, U-530 breaks the surface. The conning tower emerges first, shedding water. Then the foredeck. The boat is listing badly to port, half flooded, barely buoyant. The hatch opens. German sailors pour out, coughing, gasping for air. Some are injured. Some are in shock. The Borie sees them immediately. Searchlights snap on, illuminating the stricken U-boat. The gun crews train their weapons, 5-inch deck guns, 40mm Bofors, the 50-caliber machine guns. But the order to fire does not come. The U-boat's crew is abandoning ship. Men jump into the freezing water. Some inflate life vests. Others cling to debris. The captain is the last to leave, standing on the conning tower, watching his boat die. "30 slips beneath the surface at 03:31. It takes 46 seconds to sink. The stern goes first, pulling the rest down in a spiral of bubbles and foam. The ocean closes over it. Silence returns. The Borie moves in to recover survivors. Nets are thrown over the side. Sailors pull German submariners from the water. 31 men are rescued. 17 went down with the boat. Klaus is among the survivors. He is pulled aboard, shivering, soaked, barely conscious. An American sailor wraps him in a blanket and hands him coffee. Klaus drinks it slowly, staring at nothing. Later, in the interrogation room, he will be asked what happened. He will describe the pinging, the relentless tracking, the impossibility of escape. He will say, quietly, that they never knew the Americans could see them underwater. The interrogation officer will nod and make notes. This information will be compiled with reports from other survivors. Patterns will emerge. The Allies will learn that the Germans are still unaware of the full capability of modern sonar. They will decide to keep it that way. The sinking of U-530 was not unique. It was one incident in a broader, brutal campaign. In April 1943, U-boats sank 63 Allied ships, but the Allies sank 15 U-boats. In May, U-boats sank 41 ships. The Allies destroyed 43 U-boats. The math was brutal and clear. The exchange rate had reversed. Admiral Dönitz met with his senior commanders on May 24, 1943. The meeting took place in Berlin, in a secure conference room. The men present were exhausted. Many had lost friends, subordinates, entire crews. The reports were grim. Commander Günther Hessler presented the data. Since January, U-boat effectiveness had collapsed. Attack success rates were down 60%. Time spent submerged had doubled. Evasion attempts were failing at unprecedented rates. The conclusion was unavoidable. Allied anti-submarine technology had reached a tipping point. Dönitz asked for recommendations. The responses were cautious. Some suggested deeper diving boats. Others proposed snorkel technology to allow submerged diesel operation. A few argued for abandoning the Atlantic entirely and focusing on coastal waters. Dönitz listened. Then he made his decision. Withdraw all boats from the North Atlantic convoy routes. Effective immediately, the room went silent. This was the first strategic retreat of the U-boat campaign. It was an admission that the Allies had won a critical advantage. But Dönitz was not surrendering. He was buying time. Time to develop new technology. Time to train new crews. Time to analyze what had gone wrong. The withdrawal order was transmitted on May 24, 1943. Within 72 hours, U-boats across the Atlantic began moving to new patrol areas. The South Atlantic, the Caribbean, the Mediterranean. The wolf packs dispersed. The immediate pressure on Allied convoys eased. Ships that had been sailing under constant threat suddenly crossed the Atlantic without incident. Merchant sailors, who had spent months expecting torpedoes, began to relax. The casualty rates dropped sharply, but the cost had been extraordinary. Since 1939, the Allies had lost over 3,500 merchant ships and 72,000 sailors. Germany had lost over 650 U-boats and 30,000 submariners. The Atlantic had become a graveyard. And at the center of this shift was a technology most German sailors never fully understood. Sonar had turned the ocean transparent. Darkness was no longer protection. Depth was no longer safety. The invisible had become visible. Klaus, sitting in a prisoner of war camp in Scotland, would later tell interrogators that the hardest part was the helplessness. You could not see the enemy. You could not fight back. You could only listen to the pings and wait for the depth charges. It was, he said, like being hunted by ghosts. The withdrawal of U-boats from the North Atlantic in May 1943 marked a decisive turning point. But the war at sea was far from over. The Battle of the Atlantic continued in different forms, in different waters, with different technologies. Germany responded to the crisis with innovation. Engineers developed the snorkel, a breathing tube that allowed U-boats to run diesel engines while submerged at periscope depth. This reduced the need to surface, cutting vulnerability to radar and visual detection. By late 1943, snorkel-equipped U-boats began returning to the Atlantic. But snorkels had limitations. They were slow, they produced a visible wake, and they did nothing to counter sonar. The Kriegsmarine also accelerated development of the Type WWII U-boat, a revolutionary design with streamlined hulls, increased battery capacity, and higher submerged speeds. These boats could theoretically outrun sonar-equipped destroyers underwater. But production delays and Allied bombing campaigns meant that only a handful became operational before the war ended. Meanwhile, Allied anti-submarine forces continued to improve. Sonar technology advanced. The QHB sonar system, introduced in 1944, provided better range and resolution. Training programs expanded. More destroyer escorts entered service. Escort carriers provided air cover for convoys far into the mid-Atlantic gap, where land-based aircraft could not reach. the Allies also refined their tactics. Hunter-killer groups became more aggressive, pursuing contacts for days if necessary. Hedgehog anti-submarine mortars, which threw patterns of small contact-fused bombs ahead of the attacking ship, replaced traditional depth charges in many vessels. These weapons were more effective because they detonated on contact with the submarine hull rather than relying on proximity fuses. By 1944, the Atlantic was an Allied-controlled sea. U-boats still operated, but they were defensive, evasive, hunted. The wolf packs were gone. The second happy time was a fading memory. German submariners spoke of the Atlantic with dread. Casualty statistics tell the story. In 1944, Germany lost 241 U-boats. In 1945, another 153 were destroyed before Germany surrendered in May. The U-boat force, which had begun the war as Germany's most potent strategic weapon, ended it as a diminishing force with no realistic hope of victory. Of the 162 U-boats commissioned by the Kriegsmarine during the war, 785 were lost. The casualty rate among U-boat crews was catastrophic, approximately 75%. Of the 40,000 men who served in U-boats, around 30,000 died. It was the highest casualty rate of any branch of the German military. Survivors like Klaus spent the remainder of the war in POW camps. Many were interrogated extensively. Allied intelligence officers wanted to know what German submariners understood about sonar. The answers were revealing. Most captured U-boat crew members knew that destroyers used some form of underwater detection. But they did not understand the precision or reliability of modern sonar. Many believed it was experimental or range-limited. Some thought the pinging sounds were a psychological weapon, meant to intimidate rather than track. This misunderstanding persisted even late in the war. German Naval Command never fully grasped how thoroughly Allied sonar had neutralized the U-boat threat. Operational directives continued to emphasize surface attacks at night, as if darkness still provided concealment. It didn't. The technological and tactical lessons of the Battle of the Atlantic shaped naval warfare for decades. Sonar became a standard feature on all warships. Post-war navies invested heavily in acoustic research. The Cold War submarine race between the United States and Soviet Union was fundamentally a contest of sonar versus stealth, American, attack submarines hunting Soviet. Missile boats using increasingly sophisticated active and passive sonar systems, the doctrine of coordinated anti-submarine warfare, combining air patrols, surface ships, and underwater sensors, became the foundation of NATO naval strategy. The hunter-killer groups of 1943 evolved into modern carrier strike groups and submarine warfare task forces. The psychological impact was equally profound. For Allied sailors, the defeat of the U-boat threat was a liberation. Convoys that had crossed the Atlantic in terror now moved with confidence. The merchant mariners who had endured years of losses finally saw results. The casualty rate dropped. Ships arrived. Supplies flowed. For German submariners, the experience was traumatic. Survivors carried the memory of being hunted, trapped underwater, listening to the pings, waiting for the explosions. Many struggled with post-war life. The psychological term submariner's neurosis entered medical literature after the war, describing symptoms we would now recognize as PTSD. Klaus survived the war. He was repatriated to Germany in 1946, returned to a country in ruins. He never spoke publicly about his service. In private conversations years later, he described the moment when he realized the Americans could track them underwater as the moment he knew the war was lost. "We thought we were invisible," he said. "We thought the ocean protected us. But they could see us, hear us. They knew where we were at every moment. It was like fighting with one hand tied. No, worse. It was like fighting blind against an enemy who could see perfectly." Admiral Dönitz, who became head of the German Navy in 1943, and briefly succeeded Hitler as head of state in the final days of the war, was tried at Nuremberg. He was convicted of war crimes and sentenced to 10 years in prison. During his trial, he defended the U-boat campaign as a legitimate military strategy, but acknowledged that by mid-1943, the campaign had become unsustainable. In his memoirs, written after his release, Dönitz attributed the failure to several factors: Allied air power, improved escort tactics, radar, and, crucially, underwater detection. Systems whose capabilities we underestimated. He never used the word sonar. Perhaps he still didn't fully understand it. The men who operated those sonar systems rarely spoke about their role. Petty Officer Raymond, the sonar operator aboard the Borie, continued in the Navy after the war. He trained new operators during the Korean War. He retired in 1962. In a brief oral history interview recorded in the 1980s, he described his wartime service matter-of-factly. "We did what we were trained to do," he said. "We listened. We reported. The ship did the rest." When asked if he knew how many U-boats he helped sink, he paused. "I never counted," he said. "It wasn't personal. It was just the job." But the job had consequences. Every contact Raymond tracked, every bearing he reported, represented a U-boat crew of 40 to 50 men. Most of those men died. Their boats were crushed by pressure, torn apart by explosives, or dragged to the bottom by flooding. The survivors, like Klaus, spent years in captivity, haunted by the memory of being hunted. The strategic consequences were immense. By defeating the U-boat threat, the Allies ensured the success of the convoy system. Without those convoys, Britain could not have sustained its war effort. Without supplies from America, food, fuel, weapons, aircraft, the invasion of Normandy would have been impossible. Sonar did not win the Battle of the Atlantic alone, but it was the critical technology that turned the tide. It made the ocean transparent. It transformed the hunter into the hunted, and most remarkably, it did so while the enemy remained unaware of its full capability. Wars are often decided by the weapons that are never fully understood. The German U-boat fleet entered the Atlantic with confidence, armed with torpedoes, tactics, and the cover of darkness. They believed the ocean was their ally, vast, opaque, protective. For years, that belief held true. But technology does not respect tradition. Sound travels through water faster than light through fog. The ocean, which seemed infinite and concealing, became a trap. Sonar was not a dramatic weapon. It did not explode. It did not roar. It simply listened and spoke, ping by ping, echo by echo, revealing what was hidden. In the hands of trained operators, it became a form of vision. The invisible became visible. The silent became loud. And the hunters became the hunted. There is something deeply human in this shift. The terror of being tracked, of knowing your enemy can see you while you remain blind, is primal. It strips away the illusion of control. The German submariners, who endured hours of sonar pings and depth charge attacks, experienced a kind of warfare that was new, not just dangerous, but psychologically exhausting. They could not fight back. They could only hide, and hiding no longer worked. The lesson extends beyond the Atlantic. In every conflict, there is a moment when one side gains an invisible advantage, a technology, a tactic, a piece of intelligence that the other side does not recognize until it is too late. Sonar in 1943, radar in the Pacific, Enigma decryption at Bletchley Park. The advantage is not always in the weapon itself, but in the enemy's ignorance of it. The German sailors never knew. That ignorance cost them the battle and perhaps the war. And in the cold mathematics of history, that may be the most important fact of all. Retry scripts end ho gaya ya baki hai. Edit.